Well, there's been a huge amount of discussion about these regulations and about what appears to be the granting of diplomatic immunity to all of the people involved in the BRICS summit. Faith Mabera is a senior researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Faith, good afternoon to you, and thank you very much indeed for your time. So, we have this diplomatic immunity which has been granted to people who are being a part of this summit. Does it mean that the Russian President Vladimir Putin would now be immune from the demands by the International Criminal Court that we arrest him if he comes here?
Good afternoon, Stephen, and good afternoon to the viewers. The interpretation of this matter of the question of immunity, particularly for Putin as a sitting head of state in the build-up to his potential attendance of the BRICS summit, certainly steers us into legal terrain where there's ridden with a lot of ambiguity, if I may add that. So specifically following the recent developments and the latest issuance, confirmation and the gazetting of a notice by the Minister of International Relations of South Africa that now conferring immunities to Putin, it specifically, I think, refers us back to an interesting case, the case of, for instance, the Bashir's attendance of an AU summit here in 2015 and the subsequent sort of legal hullabaloo that attended his attendance of the summit. And what we saw happening was that South Africa was then, as per its own domestic courts, was seen as having failed to live up to obligations under international law to actually follow through on arresting Bashir. So similarly, if we extrapolate that matter now to the current issue, I think there's ambiguity in the sense that it's not very clear, particularly as to whether the absence of customary international law relating to immunity of a head of state is applicable in this matter. And I think this is the wiggle room. The fact that the Constitutional Court has not pronounced on this matter following the Bashir case, this has opened up a bit of a wiggle room for the South African state to then invoke Section 7.2 of the Diplomatic Immunities and Privileges Act, which by law and legally has grounding in actually conferring immunity to President Putin. So from the letter of the law, yes, this was actually an option available to the South African government in granting immunity to President Putin.
It seems that our government, in a way, has been tying itself up in knots around all of this. I mean, there was this sort of amazing moment where the President said that we would actually be leaving the International Criminal Court, and then the Presidency said that we wouldn't. I mean, quite bizarre. It all seems somehow a little easy. I mean, we had the International Relations Minister, Dr. Naledi, Pandor, saying that there was a legal opinion that we would still have to arrest President Putin if he came here because of the International Criminal Court. To just gazette regulation seems a very easy way around it if everybody was so confused about what to do in the first place.
In one sense, Stephen, one can argue that that's the beauty of law. If you're able to find something that is within the lines of not only jurisdiction but has legal grounding in asserting your case, then you have the upper hand at the end of the day. And I think this is what the South African government has done so far in terms, at least in the short term. And yes, you're right in saying that it's been we've been riding around in circles regarding this matter. As you correctly pointed out, we first of all put in the notice or to actually intend to withdraw from the Rome Statute. This was in 2016. Then we saw a retraction of that following the sort of retraction of the International Crimes Bill. This was after there was obviously contestation in the domestic scene about that withdrawal notice not having met parliamentary approval. So in that sort of flurry of activities, we then saw, interestingly, the timing for me was interesting because the moment the South African government actually announced that it was withdrawing the International Crimes Bill of 2017, a week later we then saw the issuance of the arrest warrant for Putin. So that for me is quite telling in some sense. But yes, it's also interesting because this question of the relationship between the horizontal relationship between a party that is state to the Rome Statute in relation to its obligation to actually act. It's a jurisdictional surrogation to the International Criminal Court is interesting because also it has to be, at least according to the South African context and how we've applied our understanding of that particular note, is that when you look at the Constitution, the South African Constitution, Section 233 says that actually immediately aligns customary law and customary international law and domestic law, which by implication means, for instance, and if you read it also in light of the Diplomatic Immunities and Privilege Act, then yes, conferment of the immunity for Putin is very much in line with that interpretation of the South African government. So in one way, that ambiguity, as I mentioned, is what has provided sort of a leeway for the South African government implementation. But in looking ahead, we can say, yes, South Africa has implemented the letter of the law, but whether it's very much in line with the spirit of the law is a matter to be questioned. It's much matter to be determined in one sense, but also the fact that particularly if you're still a party to the Rome Statute and the ICC Act, Section 27, still gives or provides for that obligation for state parties to actually ensure that they don't hinder or they don't bar the implementation or adherence to an issuance or jurisdiction of the court, particularly the ICC in this case. So there's still that matter that might be contested in the near term.
There's been a huge amount of debate about this in our society. And I wonder how really productive the debate is, because it would seem to me unlikely that the Russian president will actually come here. It doesn't matter what we do, it doesn't matter what we say. The situation in Russia itself, the invasion of Ukraine, the fact that he hasn't left that part of the world since the invasion, it seems unlikely he'll come here. Do you agree?
There's two scenarios to this, depending on, and here I'm just trying to play devil's advocate. So if you look at the messaging value, for instance, that would be centered around a visit by Putin, it would sort of double down on the kind of messaging that we've seen Russia, for instance, leading in the international arena, this particular charge and assertion that we are entering an era of multipolarity, and that by every means a great power, for instance, in the international order has every sovereign right to exercise and go where it pleases. If you're looking at it from that perspective, then there is political and messaging value in his potential visit. On the other hand, it's also ridden with a lot of legal and political ramifications, particularly from the case of South Africa. A lot of international and also domestically, a lot of actors are questioning the coherence of South Africa. Some of our foreign policy decisions are being questioned, particularly, and this issue of the ICC is one of the more acute cases, just sort of underscoring the lack of coherence around some of our foreign policy decisions. And so it's a very sort of precarious balancing act that South African government has to put forward in terms of navigating this very interesting foreign policy conundrum that we find ourselves in.
Faith Mabera, thank you. A senior researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue.